The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Cold, heavy, unbroken. The kind of rain that turned tank treads into anchors and soldiers' boots into buckets of mud. At the forward headquarters of the Third Army, a single officer stood drenched under the entryway canvas, holding a folded report in his hands like it was an unexploded shell. He didn't knock. He simply opened the flap, stepped inside, and froze when he saw the general. George S. Patton was hunched over a map table, helmet still on, fingers stained with mud and gun oil, eyes burning with the fury of a man who had not slept in 30 hours. He looked up. The officer hesitated. Patton snapped at him. "Well?" The officer swallowed hard and handed him the message. Patton snatched it, unfolded it, and read. His jaw tightened. The officers around the table stayed silent. They already knew what the report said. They had heard the first whispers 2 hours earlier. The assault on Fort Driant had failed, not stalled, not slowed, failed. Men pinned down, casualties mounting, flamethrowers burned out, Bangalore torpedoes useless, tanks stuck, engineers trapped, infantry shredded by unseen guns deep inside the concrete labyrinth. Patton crushed the paper in his fist. "Impossible," he muttered. "A bunch of antique French forts are stopping the Third Army? Absolutely impossible." The officer didn't respond. Outside, thunder rolled across the Moselle River, and the sound felt mocking. Patton straightened, glared at his staff, and said the words that would define the coming battle. "Send another assault, at once." It was the moment the humiliation began. Fort Driant didn't look like much from the outside. A grassy hill, a few concrete outcroppings, nothing like the colossal fortresses of Verdun or the Atlantic Wall. But appearances at Metz were lies carved in stone. Driant was one of 22 forts forming the outer ring of Metz, a defensive web built by the Germans after the Franco-Prussian War and later upgraded by the French. It was a fortress for a different century, but not a weaker one. The Germans had taken it back in 1940 and turned it into something even worse, a tomb designed to kill the men who entered it. The Americans of the Third Army didn't know it yet, but Driant was built like a buried battleship. 20 meters of earth and reinforced concrete layered over steel-domed turrets. Underground tunnels running hundreds of meters beneath the surface. Living quarters large enough for a garrison to survive for months. And firing ports hidden in angles so precise they created kill zones with no blind spots. When Patton's men first approached the Metz forts, they were told a comforting lie. These fortifications were old, outdated, and lightly defended, a relic, something they could crack open in a day. Patton believed it. He had just rolled across France faster than any general in American history. He had smashed the German Seventh Army, liberated towns by the dozen, and humiliated every enemy commander who dared face him. Metz looked like nothing compared to that. But then the weather changed, the rains came, the Moselle swelled, the terrain turned to soup, and the Germans, battered everywhere else, chose Metz as the place they would finally stop running. Inside Fort Driant, Colonel Hans von der Mosel commanded a hardened force of Wehrmacht specialists, engineers, machine gunners, and artillery observers trained specifically to fight inside fortresses. They had stocked the fort with ammunition, food, medical kits, and spare weapons. They had rehearsed tunnel fighting. They had memorized every shaft, every embrasure, every hidden staircase. They were not planning to hold for days. They were planning to hold for months. Patton didn't know this when he ordered the first assault. He still believed Metz was simply another obstacle his men would crash through with fire and speed. He would learn the truth the hard way. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep WW2 investigations and forgotten battles the world never talks about, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Declassified. It helps us bring you more untold stories every single week. October 3rd, 1944. The day the Americans first tried to claw their way into Fort Driant, the attack began before dawn. A creeping fog moved between the trees like something alive. The men of the 11th Infantry Regiment stepped forward with flamethrowers strapped to their backs, Bangalore torpedoes slung over their shoulders, and satchel charges so heavy they could barely walk. Tanks flanked them, inching up slopes so wet they slid backward with every push. Driant didn't react at first. No movement, no sound. It was a trap disguised as silence. When the Americans reached the outer wire and blew open the first approach trench, the world turned violent. A German machine gun nest erupted from a slit that none of the maps showed. Then a second, then a third. Within seconds, men were pinned flat against the mud. Others fell before they could even fire a single round. The engineers rushed forward trying to reach the fort's concrete cap, but flamethrower tanks were hit before they got close. The flames burst outward, spraying fire across the ground in a burning arc. Men screamed and rolled, smothering the flames with mud while under machine gun fire. Medics tried to reach them and were cut down instantly. Patton's first assault was collapsing in front of him. American tanks tried to suppress the bunkers, but artillery fire from hidden German observers slammed into them from behind, hitting the turrets with vicious accuracy. One Sherman took a direct hit and spun sideways into a crater, its crew climbing out under fire before another shell turned the tank into a fireball. The infantry realized something horrifying. The Germans inside Driant were not simply defending, they were hunting. The Americans finally managed to blast open a steel door on the fort's surface. A squad rushed inside and disappeared into the darkness. Inside the tunnels, they found corridors twisting like veins through stone. Echoes bounced off the walls. The only light came from the faint glow of their flashlights, cutting through layers of dust. A single German machine gun opened up somewhere in the blackness. Then grenades rolled along the tunnel floor. Then nothing. The radio from that squad went silent. Outside on the surface, the attack was grinding to a halt. The men were out of flamethrower fuel, out of explosives, and almost out of stamina. Mud had swallowed their gear. The rain drowned their gun barrels. The fort was not only resisting, it seemed to be absorbing every blow. By the end of the first day, the Americans had gained only a few yards of ground and lost dozens of men. The officers on the line knew what the report would say even before they wrote it. The attack had failed, but at headquarters, Patton refused to accept it. When the casualty report arrived, Patton read it once, slowly, then again, faster. His staff waited for the explosion they knew was coming. Patton slammed his fist on the map table so hard the compasses jumped. "Those forts are old French junk," he barked. "If the Krauts can hold them, then we're not hitting hard enough." One of his senior officers tried to speak. "General, intelligence underestimated the construction. The Germans—" "I don't want excuses," Patton snapped. "I want that fort." Patton's rage wasn't just about the tactical situation. He was fighting two battles at once, one against the Germans at Metz, another against the Allied High Command. He felt Bradley was watching him, waiting for a mistake. He knew Montgomery would love to see him fail, and Eisenhower, though a friend, had begun questioning Patton's judgment after the slapping incidents and public controversies. Patton needed a victory at Metz to restore the momentum that had defined his Third Army since Normandy. A static, grinding siege was the opposite of everything he represented. Every hour spent stuck outside Metz was a humiliation. So, he doubled down. "Send in fresh companies," he ordered. "Get engineers, get artillery. Take that fort apart, brick by damned brick." "But, sir—" "Do it." The staff obeyed. Even though they knew the truth, Fort Driant wasn't a fortress. It was a trap, and Patton had walked into it willingly. On October 4th, the Germans changed tactics. They knew Patton would not back down. They understood his personality better than he realized. They anticipated another assault and prepared a counter-performance designed to shatter American confidence. Before dawn, Driant erupted. Artillery hidden kilometers behind the fortress opened fire with terrifying precision. The shells didn't fall randomly. They targeted assembly areas, supply lines, tank positions, and exposed rifle squads with pinpoint accuracy. This wasn't blind bombardment. These were the calculations of veteran fortress observers who had spent years mastering how to use overlapping angles, invisible to the naked eye, to trap enemy forces. Every time the Americans tried to form up, another barrage hit. Every time tanks rolled forward to provide cover, anti-tank rounds from unseen embrasures ricocheted off the slopes. Driant's turrets, long dormant during the first day, suddenly rotated into position and unleashed fire. Inside the fort, the defenders moved like they were part of the structure itself. They used tunnels and blast-proof doors to shift from one firing point to another before the Americans could react. A machine gun would open fire from the east, then vanish. Another opened from the south. Then a mortar tube thumped from underground, sending rounds arcing onto the Americans' rear positions. The fort felt alive. Engineers attempting to blow entry points were met with grenades dropped from unseen murder holes. A flamethrower team managed to reach a bunker entrance only to be ambushed by riflemen firing from a slit no wider than a hand. The men on the ground began whispering that the fort could see them, that the Germans inside had eyes in the earth, that no matter where they moved, something in the stone was watching. It wasn't superstition, it was engineering. Driant had been designed after France lost the Franco-Prussian War, built to survive modern artillery, built with overlapping fields of fire, built with trenches, wire, and concrete angled to make every approach suicidal. It was never meant to stop a blitzkrieg in open terrain. It was meant to stop exactly what Patton was trying to do. Close assault. The more the Americans pushed, the more the fort pushed back. By October 5th, the battle was no longer being fought above ground. Most of the fort's surface was too exposed, too covered by machine gun arcs, or too cratered from artillery to allow movement. So the Americans did the only thing they could. They went inside. Small assault teams crawled through blown openings, stepped over rubble, and descended into stairwells still dripping with condensation. The air inside Driant was like breathing through a cloth soaked in rust and earth. The walls were slick. Every footstep echoed. Every sound seemed amplified. Darkness swallowed everything. Flashlights barely pierced the tunnels. The beams flickered over steel doors, narrow passages, and deep shafts leading downward into complete blackness. This was not combat Patton's men had trained for. They were used to open fields, sweeping tank maneuvers, fast advances. This was a labyrinth. The first teams tried to map the tunnels. They got lost within minutes. Landmarks meant nothing. Each corridor looked identical. Some led to pillboxes, some led to dead ends, some led to dark corners where German grenades waited on tripwires. In one tunnel, Americans turned a corner and found a pile of sandbags. They approached cautiously. A German rifleman hidden behind them opened fire, hitting the lead soldier in the chest. His squad scrambled back, dragging him by his webbing belt as rounds cracked overhead. In another section, a squad encountered a door with a ventilation grate. They fired into the grate, believing Germans were behind it. The echoes were louder than expected. The tunnel behind the door split into 3 directions. Within seconds, Germans flanked them from both sides, firing into their backs. The men fought blind. Grenades bounced unpredictably. Rifles smoked in the cramped air. One flamethrower burst inside a tunnel and sucked all oxygen from the space, leaving both Americans and Germans gasping for breath in pitch darkness. Some tunnels were so tight, men had to crawl on hands and knees, pushing rifles ahead of them. At one point, an entire squad became trapped when the Germans sealed a blast door behind them and threw smoke grenades into the room. The oxygen dropped. The men hammered on the steel until their knuckles bled, but no one could hear them through the stone. Survivors later said the fort felt like it was swallowing them, and the Germans used every psychological trick they could. They fired single, deliberate shots, spaced apart, so the Americans never knew where the shooter was. They shouted orders in the tunnels to confuse the attackers. They let flashlights flicker in the distance to lure Americans deeper into dead ends. By the end of the day, tunnel teams had taken heavy casualties, captured almost nothing, and realized the terrible truth. No matter how far they went inside, the fort just kept going. By October 6th, the situation at Fort Driant had moved beyond tactical difficulty. It was becoming a personal burden on Patton's pride, his reputation, and his command. Every hour of failure echoed louder than the artillery on the field. At dawn, a jeep rolled up to 3rd Army headquarters, carrying a long, grim casualty list. Patton watched the officer approach and already felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He knew what the numbers meant. He knew what his enemies inside Chafe would say. He knew what the newspapers back home would write if this humiliation leaked. The officer saluted and handed him the paper. Patton unfolded it with slow, deliberate movements, the tent silent except for the distant thump of German artillery. He read the names. Then he read the causes of death: tunnel fighting, machine gun fire, anti-personnel mines, flamethrower malfunction, suffocation, structural collapse. A single line caught his eye: missing, presumed trapped inside fort. He looked up, face red. "How many times have we attacked?" 3 major assaults, sir, multiple probes." "And how much ground gained?" "Barely any, sir." Patton slammed the paper onto the table. "God damn it, this is a siege. I don't fight sieges." His staff remained quiet. They had seen Patton angry, but this was different. This was anger mixed with disbelief. Patton's entire identity as a commander was built on speed, shock, and unrelenting offensive action. Metz was a slow, methodical, entrenched fortress battle. It was the antithesis of who he was. He paced back and forth, boots slapping against dirt floorboards. He cursed the French for building the forts. He cursed the Germans for using them. He cursed the rain, the mud, the river, the weather, the terrain. In his private diary, he wrote that even God Almighty seemed to be helping the Germans at Metz. Some officers suggested bypassing the fort entirely. Others proposed starving it out. None dared mention the option Patton feared most: withdrawal. Patton finally grabbed his helmet, yanked open the tent flap, and marched toward a waiting jeep. "Take me to the front," he barked. He needed to see the battlefield himself, needed to reassure the men, needed to convince himself that Driant would break if he pushed hard enough. What he found instead was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He walked the ruined slopes of Driant where tanks stood abandoned like metal corpses. He saw medics carrying stretchers through mud so deep it swallowed their boots. He saw engineers sitting in silence, faces blackened with soot, staring at the fort as if it were a living monster. He spoke to platoon leaders who had lost half their men. He met a young soldier who said he heard screams coming from inside the tunnels at night. When Patton looked up at the fortress, rain rolling off the steel turrets, he felt the rarest sensation of his career: doubt. Driant wasn't a battle, it was a warning. But the general in him still refused to listen. By October 9th, the truth could no longer be buried under determination. Supplies were running out. Flamethrowers had no fuel. Engineers had burned through all remaining explosives. Infantry companies were down to half strength. The weather was getting worse. Artillery accuracy was collapsing, and every new assault on Driant looked exactly like the last. The Germans showed no sign of weakening. Their fire was just as accurate, their machine guns just as deadly, their tunnels just as deep. The fort was undefeated. Patton called his senior commanders to a private meeting inside a commandeered farmhouse near the Moselle. Rain hammered the windows. The men sat around a wooden table littered with maps, empty canteens, and spent shell casings used as improvised paperweights. Patton entered. No jokes, no swagger, no bravado. He looked at the faces of the officers who had fought and bled for him these past months, men who had trusted him through France, who had driven at impossible speeds, who had smashed German lines everywhere they went. He saw exhaustion, and he finally understood. The Third Army could not take Fort Driant, not now, not under these conditions, not before winter, not without sacrificing an entire division for a hill that held no strategic value anymore. He placed both hands on the table and exhaled slowly. "Gentlemen," he said, "we're pulling back." The words felt unnatural, like he was speaking a foreign language. Some officers were relieved, others were shocked. A few stared in disbelief, not because they disagreed, but because they had never heard Patton say anything resembling surrender. He continued, "We'll regroup, reevaluate, attack Metz from the north and east. Driant can rot in its tunnels." He paused. "And this stays quiet. Understood?" They all nodded. The withdrawal began that night. Under darkness, under rain, under the weight of humiliation. Wounded men were carried down the slopes. Tanks reversed slowly, tracks grinding through mud. Engineers detonated leftover charges to cover the retreat. Entire companies moved silently, not speaking, not looking back. The Germans inside Driant watched from periscopes, but did not fire. They knew victory when they saw it. By dawn, Fort Driant stood untouched, unbeaten, unbroken. And for the first time in the war, George S. Patton had been forced to retreat. When the Americans finally withdrew, the defenders inside Fort Driant remained alert, rifles ready, expecting another wave. But none came. Instead, they heard only rain, wind, and the distant rumble of American artillery shifting to targets elsewhere around Metz. In the tunnels, German officers walked through the corridors with lanterns. Some checked the blast doors. Others inspected the gun turrets. A medic treated the wounded in a room lit by a single flickering bulb. They had held. They had resisted one of the greatest armies on earth, And they had done it from a position most German commanders thought would crumble within hours. One defender later wrote that they didn't feel triumphant. They felt astonished. The fort had taken strikes from a 105mm artillery pieces, tank fire, flamethrower jets, and explosive charges. The Americans had infiltrated the upper galleries, broken into 2 outer bunkers, and destroyed several defensive guns. Yet the fortress still lived. It wasn't until December 1944, weeks after Patton took Metz by maneuvering around the forts, that Driant finally surrendered. And not because it was conquered. The Germans simply ran out of food and water and received orders to withdraw. The fortress hadn't been defeated by assault. It had been defeated by the calendar. Patton never spoke publicly about Fort Driant in detail. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even in his memoirs. He mentioned Metz as a campaign. He praised his men. He blamed terrain and weather. But Driant itself, its tunnels, its failures, its lessons, remained largely absent. The silence was deliberate. Privately, in his diary, he wrote 8 words that captured his true feelings. Driant was a tough nut, too tough. He didn't blame his soldiers. He blamed the circumstances, the rain, the mud, the lack of intelligence, the old French engineers who built the fortifications, even God, whom he half-jokingly accused of siding with the Germans that month. But deep down, Patton knew what Driant represented. It was the one place in Europe where his style of warfare simply didn't apply. His speed was irrelevant. His aggression had no effect. His tanks were useless. His artillery couldn't break concrete buried under 20 meters of earth. His infantry couldn't maneuver. His engineers couldn't penetrate the tunnels. Everything that made the Third Army unstoppable elsewhere was neutralized inside that hill. It was a battlefield where a different kind of general would have excelled, a siege fighter, a specialist in fortress warfare, a man who embraced slow, methodical, grinding attrition. Patton was not that man, and he knew it. In the decades after the war, soldiers and historians studied Fort Driant as a rare example of a fortress beating a modern mechanized army. Patton himself never returned to Metz, but those who served with him said the battle changed something in him. He became more cautious around fortifications, more attentive to intelligence reports, more willing to bypass strong points instead of smashing through them. He stopped believing that sheer aggression could solve every problem. Driant had humbled him, not in front of cameras, not in front of his men, but in front of the truth. The truth that even the greatest generals are shaped by the battles they lose, not the ones they win. Fort Driant was never a decisive moment in the war. It didn't change the front lines. It didn't slow the Allied advance for long. It didn't save the German army. But it cut into the myth of Patton's invincibility. It forced him to confront his limits. It reminded him that the battlefield can expose the weaknesses a man hides from the world. The fortress still stands today, its tunnels silent, its concrete cracked, its steel rusting. But inside those dark walls lies the memory of a week in 1944, when George S. Patton, the unstoppable force of the Third Army, met an immovable object, and for once in the war, the immovable object won. For a battle the world barely remembers, Fort Driant tells an extraordinary story, not just of the Americans who fought in impossible conditions or the Germans who held a fortress built for another century. It tells the story of Patton's one undeniable failure, a moment where even the greatest warrior of the Western Front was forced to step back, look at the battlefield, and admit, "This one is beyond me." If you want more forgotten battles, lost stories, and declassified histories, Subscribe to WW2 Declassified. The past still has secrets, and we're here to uncover them.